Landlords TV, a production of Landlords New York. This is L&T Time with Michelle, the show where you get to have a cup of tea with me, Michelle Murato-Itkowitz, and we discuss an area that I have been practicing law in the city of New York for over 20 years, and that's real estate. And today I am honored to have as my guest Neil Kersner of Albrin Real Estate. And Neil, you are a Landlords New York member for?
About a month, Michelle.
Okay, about a month. Very good. All right, so let me see if I have your stats down. You started your career on Wall Street at a very interesting time in Wall Street's history. And then you got your MBA at Wharton at UPenn, manufacturing, distribution, heavy business career, but the call of real estate pulled you, and interestingly enough, you ended up in mobile home parks. So you have a slew of mobile home parks all across the United States.
That's correct, Michelle. Yes, real estate's been in my blood for a long time, and I finally pulled the plug and did something about it several years ago.
And the family in New York and their buildings kept saying, Neil, now that you're in real estate, manage our buildings, come back, take over Albrin, take over our buildings, and eventually you succumbed to that too.
Well, that's correct. I mean, typically in New York, you have an older generation that owns a lot of building stock, and they don't know what to do with it as they pass it on. And New York requires people with experience to know how to navigate through our regulations. So they asked me to come on board, and since coming on board, I've expanded the business markedly. We manage buildings throughout New York City.
So you're located in Queens, but you have buildings all over the city.
That's correct.
And interestingly enough, you mentioned to me that even though your other holdings are extensive and they're across the United States, it takes a fraction of your time to manage compared with what the New York City real estate takes.
Yeah, I mean, New York is an extremely difficult place to do business because of the regulations, the laws, the supervision. When you do business outside of New York in various jurisdictions, where the court systems are pro-landlord, and there are many of them, and the court system and the regulations leave you alone. I'm able to manage hundreds of tenants across the country part-time. And in New York, I'm able to manage hundreds of tenants, rent-stabilized tenants, full-time with a full staff.
And a lot of people have this exact problem. And you also mentioned to me, New York City is just filled with curveballs for the person who owns a building, which is why you need a good management company.
Yes.
And specifically, we could talk about a million of those curveballs, but today you were going to help our audience out with backflow prevention regulators.
Yes. A couple of years ago, the DEP passed a new regulation that got put into New York City law that most buildings, not all buildings, needed a backflow preventer, an RPZ, a reduced pressure valve. And the concept of it is really very, very good, because the idea is the fresh water from the city flows into your buildings, and what they want to do in the event of an accident or an emergency, if that water were to become contaminated, they want to prevent it from being able to flow back into the freshwater pipes. So they've required buildings to put in backflow preventers. Again, just a great concept. The execution, however, being the city of New York, makes it a lot more difficult.
The first level of that, I find, is a lot of people just don't understand if their building needs the backflow regulator. Well, but it seems if you look on the city's website, it sweeps in a lot of buildings. Is that true?
It sweeps in most buildings. A building that has a boiler that requires chemical treatment, which is any steel boiler, which is probably most boilers, qualifies under this. If you have retail stores, you have a dry cleaner, you have a restaurant, you have a deli, you're likely to be required to have a backflow preventer. And often the only way you find out about it is either getting a fine from DEP or an order from DEP.
So you need a licensed plumber. I'm going to assume you need to pull a permit, you need...
Like everything else, it's not easy. The DEP and the city do not trust the landlords to do the right thing, so they have required that you hire a professional engineer and or architect to design the system. They have very specific rules as to what the system should look like. You then have to get it approved by DEP. You then have to install it. You then have to have it inspected and then get it signed off. And that's a very time-consuming and onerous process.
And I bet expensive.
It's very expensive.
And so when you're done, are there at least any other benefits in the building? Is the water pressure better in your building when you're done?
No, that's actually, you were referring to curveballs. That's really one of the dirty little secrets, is that if you have a building that's big enough, I have installed them in buildings that are 6 stories tall. What they don't tell you is because you have reduced the pressure, it reduces the water pressure. And significantly, to the point that your 5th and 6th floor tenants will start complaining that they do not have enough pressure even to flush a toilet or to take a shower.
So then the solution to that is?
The solution to that is putting in
pump?
a very expensive pump. And again, that can be just as expensive as the backflow preventer.
So maybe the tip here for the membership is plan the pump in if you have to at the beginning. Would that help?
As you should, because you are, again, required to have a permit for it. So you might, as long as you're designing it, and as long as you're getting an approval, and as long as you're getting a permit, you might as well tie that all into one system at one time. Yes.
That's actually great advice. Could you hang out for a little bit and just watch me do the teaching portion?
I'd love to, thanks.
Okay, so we'll be right back. Okay. So what we're talking about today is the multiple dwelling registration and the effect of not doing it on a landlord and tenant case. So multiple dwelling law 325 says that every property manager and every owner has to file a form with the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, that says the address of an officer or director of the owner, if the owner is a corporation, or an address for the property manager. So basically, the multiple dwelling registration's real purpose is to connect human beings with the building in case they have to be found by the department. Now, it's a simple little form. It's $13 to register it. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is if you allow your multiple dwelling registration to lapse, the statute gives some pretty stiff penalties. And the penalty is that a landlord is not allowed to recover rent from a tenant when the multiple dwelling registration is not filed. Now, it's a tricky little thing because recover rent means the following. If the tenant voluntarily pays the rent, the landlord can take it. If the tenant pays the rent and there's no multiple dwelling registration, the landlord takes it, the tenant can't sue to get it back. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is the issue that the landlord can't recover the rent. The landlord can't sue the tenant for the rent if they don't have the multiple dwelling registration. And to actually bring this home, the uniform rules of the civil court of the city of New York actually really bring this home, because the civil court is where summary proceedings are brought for the recovery of non-payment of rent. So your non-payments are in civil court, and civil court says in your non-payment petition, you must allege something to us about the multiple dwelling registration. You either have to say that this building is not a multiple dwelling, which by the way is 3 or more units, 3 or more residential units, or it has to say it is a multiple dwelling and we are in full compliance with the multiple dwelling law. So you have to be able to plead that. I always check, whether I'm representing a landlord or a tenant, I always check the multiple dwelling registration status before I start working on a case. Sometimes you see that people just let it lapse, especially when a building has changed hands. So can this be fixed? Let's say you own a building, or your property manager, your lawyers brought a case, and then the tenant asserts a defense, no multiple dwelling registration. It's not the end of the world in this sense. This is an amendable defect, which means your lawyer can just put the case on hold, and you fill out the forms, you pay the $13, you ask the court to amend your petition, and you can get the train back on the track on that one. But it's just something to keep up with. It's a stitch in time saves 9 kind of landlord and tenant litigation thing. Make sure before you seek rent from a tenant that your multiple dwelling registration is up to date. So Neil, what did you think of the teaching section?
I learned a lot. Thanks for sharing.
Would you come back and maybe talk to us about Local Law 11 next time?
I look forward to that.
Thank you very much. This is Landlords TV, you're watching L&T Time with Michelle, brought to you by Landlords New York.